Welcome back to this I24 News Evening Edition. I'm David Matlin here, and this is the One-on-One. Well, the United Nations was founded in the aftermath of World War II with the primary goal to prevent the world from going to war in the future by providing an equal platform for dialogue between nations. But world peace has proven a difficult ideal to achieve, and since its establishment, the UN has sometimes received criticism, especially in the case of the many resolutions it's passed regarding Israel. Well, joining me tonight is Hillel Neuer, the executive director of UN Watch, an NGO based in Geneva, whose mandate is to monitor the performance of the United Nations. Well, Mr. Neuer has testified before the United Nations Human Rights Council and the U.S. Congress many times. Well, Hillel, thanks for joining us here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So start out by telling us a little about your organization and the background there.
UN Watch was founded 20 years ago in 1993 with the mission to monitor the world body according to the principles of its own charter. The ideals, the founding ideals of the United Nations are noble. The founders included people like Eleanor Roosevelt from America and René Cassin of France, eminent idealists who helped create the Human Rights Commission. But sadly, over time, things have got hijacked. Today, we have a Human Rights Commission where recently China, Cuba, Russia, Saudi Arabia were elected. So UN Watch is often the voice for decency and for reason in a place that seems to have lost both.
Well, we'll cut for a minute here. Last week at the UN, an interpreter that didn't realize that the microphone was on made some comments about the amount of resolutions being passed there or being presented against Israel. Let's take a look.
5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine. There's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, non? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad shit. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
The interpreter apologized.
Well, she's expressing something there that a lot of people in Israel would already agree with and feel is a rational thing there. I guess that jumps us right to the topic of how Israel has received lopsided, I guess one word for it, attention from the United Nations in the form of drafted resolutions condemning it. What do you have to say about that? Where have you found your position in that arena?
Well, you know, they say that the truth gets lost in translation. Not this time. This time, that interpreter spoke the plain truth. She's sitting there interpreting from Spanish into English, one after one resolution after another. Just a week ago on Thursday in the United Nations General Assembly, for a total of 9 resolutions that were adopted that day on Israel, and not a single one on the rest of the world. Nothing on Syria, Sudan, China. It's really extraordinary. And this poor woman has to sit there and, with a straight face, to interpret all of these things, and finally she broke. She didn't know the microphone was on, but she told the simple truth. Why, you know, there's all this other really bad stuff happening. No one's doing anything about anything else. And she said in French, "C'est un peu trop, non? It's a bit much, don't you think?" And it is a bit much. That was perhaps the understatement of the year. And it's something that happens all the time. In the General Assembly in New York, there are 22 resolutions this year that will single out Israel, and there'll be only 4 on the rest of the world combined. It's absurd. And where we're based, our organization, UN Watch, is based in Geneva, where they have the world's top human rights body. And again, there's about 50% of the resolutions on Israel, and they just elected last week China, Russia, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia. And instead you have, one of the resolutions last year was a resolution sponsored by Syria, which has gassed its own people, has killed over 100,000 of its own people. A resolution condemning Israel was sponsored by Syria. And you had the Syrian leader accusing Israel of acting like Nazi Germany. So really things are upside down. And on these resolutions, it's important to recall who votes for them. So on some of them, we saw on the video that UN Watch posted, and that was played by Prime Minister Netanyahu in the Sunday cabinet meeting. One of those videos had the vote was 160 voting in favor of condemning Israel, and it was a handful, maybe 5 or 6, that voted no, and a few abstaining. And it's important to recall that the European Union states, by and large, vote for these. So leading democracies are aiding and abetting the singling out of Israel, often for political reasons.
Well, I think this highlights an inherent flaw in the United Nations and the equality that each nation has an equal vote there. Many of these smaller developing nations have very specific interests or are easily, I guess for lack of a better term, bought off by larger interests, by the large influential blocs with a lot of money. In the case of Israel, the Arab bloc. So it's very easy for these small countries. They don't really have an option in a lot of the cases with these votes. If they go against their backers, say the Arab bloc, who's putting tons of money into their economies, they don't have a choice to vote on, per se, what they perceive as right or wrong. It's more that their vote's already dictated by larger interests. It's an inherent flaw, no?
Well, yeah, that's right. A lot of UN decisions are decided in back rooms, through backroom deals, through politicization. The election last week of China and Russia, where they got 176 votes, or the UN resolutions on Israel. There are large regional groupings, political groupings. There's something called the non-aligned movement, which are countries from the third world, the developing world. You have the Arab group, which is very strong. The Islamic group is 56 states. If you talk about the resolutions on Israel, one of the key factors, some of the key factors at play are vote trading. Vote trading is key at the UN. You vote for me, I vote for you. So there's 56 Islamic countries that say, go to other countries around the world, whether it's in South America or in Africa, Asia, and say, if you don't vote for our resolution condemning Israel, no matter how one-sided, politicized, and harmful and counterproductive it is to the United Nations' own declared efforts to achieve peace and to bridge peoples together, not to polarize them and push them further apart. If you don't vote for us, we're not going to vote for you on whatever pet issue you may have. We have vast oil reserves. We're not going to give your country oil, and that was used in the 70s to get African states to actually sever relations with Israel. And we have billions of dollars in sovereign wealth funds, which could invest in your country or not. And it's not just small countries. Country like Brazil, in the WikiLeaks papers, we saw Brazil telling the U.S. they're voting for various Islamic-sponsored resolutions because they're afraid for their economic interests. So it's very cynical and it's very politicized, and it goes counter to the UN's founding ideals. Very sad.
What's a country like Israel to do? They've fought vigorously in the UN General Assembly over the years in defense of their position, yet it's proven more or less fruitless here in the efforts of the UN. What could Israel do? Have they, in your opinion, have they made mistakes over the years here in combating this issue, or are they doing what they can?
Well, I think the game is fixed to a large degree. We know that on these 22 resolutions this year, the majorities will be typically 160 in favor, 180, and Israel is left to manage some of the margins, meaning that Israeli diplomats now speak of the moral majority, whereas you're going to get 160, but if it's the Libyans and the Syrians and so forth, but how do the Europeans vote? And if you get the Czechs on your side, and the Australians and the Canadians and the Americans, and sometimes the Germans, and on a given issue, when we had a UN conference that singled out Israel, the Durban III conference in 2011, France pulled out of that conference. Germany pulled out of that conference. Britain pulled out of that conference. That was very significant. So although you had this conference and it embraced the 2001 Durban Declaration, which singled out Israel as a racist state and no other country, but in 2011, if you had 14 countries pulling out, Austria as well, that's a very powerful message. The High Commissioner remarked in 2009, when 10 countries pulled out of the Durban II conference, she said, every country that pulled out was a knife in my back. So although you might lose on the numbers, it's important to get the moral majority. And part of the work that we do at UN Watch is to explain who stands behind those votes. Many people believe if the UN Human Rights Council decided something, well, it's men wearing white beards walking on Mount Olympus.
Carries an authority.
Great authority, and think that it's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But in fact, the Human Rights Council was Muammar Gaddafi, who was elected chair of the Human Rights Council, Fidel Castro, who was just reelected last week, his regime, and the House of Saud. And people need to know that. And part of the message that we get across is understanding who stands behind these. And that's very important to understand how these things work.
Well, another aspect of the UN Charter, the UN definitely provides massive amounts of humanitarian aid across the world in many disaster areas and all sorts of conflict zones. But in the founding charter, I guess, in their efforts to resolve conflict, they've proven largely ineffective. Does that mean that the UN needs to be realigned in some way, or is it actually an effective body as it is?
Well, the United Nations is a cacophony. It's a Tower of Babel. There's people speaking multiple languages, each with their own interests. And we shouldn't expect too much from it. It depends which agency. There are different agencies. The General Assembly is this large forum, 193 countries. You have smaller forums like the Security Council, where 5 countries have the veto. But it often depends on where the political will is there. The United Nations is a forum. If the political will is there from the people who have the votes and the power in that forum, be it the Security Council or General Assembly, the UN can rally behind certain decisions. We saw in the Security Council there was political will to stop Gaddafi from murdering his own people. The UN Security Council authorized concrete action to defend civilians, and moments later, France, Britain, supported by the US, went and took out Gaddafi. So if the political will is there, the UN can help. If it's not, it's limited what it can do.
Well, perhaps this is a large question, but for someone like yourself who's involved with what's happening at the UN. What changes, if any, do you envision being effective at the UN? How can it better improve its efficiency?
Well, there's a host of many things. Where do we begin, right?
Sure.
I think, many people speak about grand reforms. I don't want to speak about grand reforms because I don't think they're realistic. People want to reform the Security Council and give other countries the veto. These things are very complicated. We saw with the Human Rights Commission. In 2003, as I mentioned, they elected Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Right. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, said, this body's not working. It's politicized. It's selective. And countries are joining not to improve human rights, but to shield their own records of abuse. He scrapped it and created the new Human Rights Council. And guess what? We're back to square one. Once again, electing China, Russia, Cuba, Saudi Arabia. These are the worst regimes in the world. So when people talk about ground reform, I say, you know what? I don't want ground reform. I want the good guys, those who are meant to be democratic countries and leading democratic forces, let them do the right thing. And so UN Watch led a coalition of some 40 members of parliament and human rights groups, the vice president of the European Parliament. We called on US Ambassador Samantha Power. We called on EU Foreign Affairs Commissioner Catherine Ashton. Say something against the election of these awful dictatorships. They wouldn't say a word. So forget about grand reforms. Let's just get the leaders of democratic forces to speak out in favor of basic human rights criteria, the criteria that the UN itself has for membership. And they're not saying things. We want those countries to introduce resolutions, even if you don't get the majority, in favor of doing a resolution to condemn China's massive abuses, imprisonment of journalists and human rights defenders, Cuba's persecution of bloggers, Saudi Arabia's persecution of women and religious dissidents. Even if the resolution, you won't get the majority, introduce the resolution, create that spotlight, turn the spotlight on the abuser. And these are happening, really in the minority of cases. Most countries lack the courage and political will. I don't want ground reform. I want to see the good guys standing up and getting some spine.
Well, I assume you've already mentioned some of the examples, but in your work at UN Watch, now tell us about some of the issues that you think the world needs to be paying attention to that they're not. What are some things that need more attention right now?
Well, our concern at UN Watch is human rights. We're sitting across the street from the Human Rights Council. We're a non-governmental organization accredited to the United Nations to see that they're doing what they should be doing. So on human rights, we're seeing, in most cases, silence. We look around the world, we look in a country like Zimbabwe, which was the breadbasket of Africa, and millions have fled the country, and people are hungry. And Mugabe has destroyed that country. And the UN elected Mugabe to be head of the World Tourism Union just a few months ago and had a major summit in Zimbabwe. We want to see the UN talk about Zimbabwe. We want to see the UN talk about Sri Lanka, which they're not talking about enough, where 40,000 people were killed in 2009, civilians. There's been no real accountability. We want to see them talking about China. Wang Binjiang, of a pro-democracy dissident, it remains behind bars in China. The UN is not saying anything about it. Tibet, a country that was trampled by the Chinese government, Buddhist temples destroyed. There's no resolution on China. We want to see action on Cuba, where there was an expert at the Human Rights Council to investigate Cuba. That was eliminated. Cuba became very powerful there, and instead Cuba was elected. We want to see discussion about Egypt, where we have coup d'etats, 1,000 people were massacred, maybe some were violent. Human Rights Council didn't say a thing, and they refused to say anything about Saudi Arabia. As I said, they just elected them, but women are subjugated. If you're not Muslim, you cannot practice your religion. Christians were arrested earlier this year, Ethiopian Christians, for praying in their own homes, and the Human Rights Council is saying nothing. So we want to see, there's a few resolutions. We had something this year on Syria. We're seeing a few things, but the vast majority of the world's worst abusers go ignored. We want to see the Human Rights Council live up to its own standards. The mechanisms are there. All the tools are there. We just need to see the political will to be a voice for victims. That's what the UN, people around the world look to the UN to be a voice for victims, and we need to see much more of it. We're not seeing it. And I'm just going to mention that that's one of the things that we feel the void. Is UN Watch is holding a human rights summit we do every year called the Geneva Summit on Human Rights. People can see it on genevasummit.org. And we're bringing some of the most famous, courageous champions of human rights, dissidents who paid the price. It's going to be in February 25th in 2014 in Geneva. And it's an extraordinary event. We have it every year with 25 human rights groups. We're having it a week before the Human Rights Council opens. And we're going to say to the world, these are the voices of human rights. Listen to them. Hear their cries.
Well, short answer here, we're almost out of time. You mentioned the struggles that many of the places in the world that need the help the most are not getting through the current mechanism there. Is the UN, the way it's built today, still truly a relevant body?
Well, like it or not, the United Nations matters. You go Pew Global Survey poll of major Western countries, and you see 50 to 60, 70% regard the UN as credible. Their decisions go around the world, translated into every language. Like it or not, the UN matters. And it's a responsibility for those of us who want to see it work better. It's not going away. It has an influence that is global. And I think it's an obligation for the democracies who are there and who have a responsibility to step up to the plate. And that's what we want to see happen.
Well, great. Well, good luck in your continued endeavors there in Geneva. And thank you for your time here today. Hillel Neuer, the head of NGO UN Watch. Thank you for being here tonight on the Evening Edition's One-on-One. And that sums up our One-on-One here. Stay tuned and stay tuned for more headlines here, and see us tomorrow night here on the Evening Edition.